Hey everybody, welcome to SOFcast. I'm Mike Lundstrom here with my co-host.
Hey, I'm Master Gunnery Sergeant Chance Stanley.
And we have another special guest for you today. Before I tell you who he is, just let me let you know that we are still down in Tampa this week, downtown at SOF Week, and doing interviews. And the person that came in to join us today is none other than our ASD SOLIC, or what we call Assistant Secretary of Defense Special Operations Low Intensity Conflict. That's a big title. Chris Maier, how are you doing today, sir?
Good.
The Honorable Chris Maier, I should say.
Yeah, thank you. You can call me Chris.
Chris is fine. Great. Awesome. So real quick, I'm going to ask you some questions, but I just kind of want to get in a little bit of history here so our audience understands what this is. So in 1987, USSOCOM was established by Congress that gave us the ability to put all of our SOF special operations professionals together. And over time that grew. And also with the establishment of that came the office for the ASD SOLIC. And that is a civilian entity attached to the hip to us. 2019, Congress legislated oversight and advocacy for that office, just like a service-like responsibility under Title 10, Section 167. Our commander has that, but prior to that, we didn't have a service-like secretary. So that's what Chris represents for SOCOM, and both oversight and advocacy, just like every other service. It's very important. That's how we're built in this country for our military. So, sir, with that said, now with that context, if you would, just tell the audience a little bit about yourself, your background, and then leading up to this position here, and then we're going to get to some more questions.
Sure.
Great to have you, by the way.
Yeah, thanks. You took the words out of my mouth. I was going to say, finally, able to do a SOFcast, and so great to be able to do it here in Tampa with, as we were just talking off camera, seeing virtually everybody it feels like you've encountered in your career seems to be here for SOF Week. So
it's a melting pot.
Yeah, it's a melting pot. And we were just commenting, those that I've worked with in the past in uniform, they look a lot different sometimes when they get out of uniform and are doing nonetheless very valuable things for the community. So my background is been a career government person for my whole career prior to the last couple of positions here. And this position I'm in now is a Senate confirmed one. So ceased to be a standard government employee, but my experience has been growing up in the counterterrorism community, worked tremendously with SOF over the last decade, actually 2 decades probably. Started with that organization we don't mention in the intelligence community as an analyst, and then moved to the National Counterterrorism Center when that stood up, and then moved to the Department of Defense in 2015.
And you're a civilian the entire time here, or you're in uniform?
No, I was a civilian the entire time.
That's important to understand.
Yes, and I am a Air National Guardsman officer, intel officer type. But
so
that
you do have a uniform?
Yes, I do, but it gets worn on the weekends principally, and for deployments outside of this context. So that's my background. Originally from California, and I'm the oldest of 7 kids, so that gives me a certain perspective when I'm sitting in meetings and the senior leadership says, well, if we do this for SOF, we have to do this for every other community like cyber and space. So I have some experience with how to push back on that mentality just from growing up as the oldest of 7 kids. So.
Thank you. Awesome. So one of the things we like to do at SOFcast, and we're trying to push more towards, is resonate more with the teams that are out there in the team room, sort of understand our enterprise better, and just from a basic or cursory level, kind of explain your office and your role. I know I gave a little history, but there's more to it than that, and a very important function to our enterprise.
Yeah, your setup was really good, because I think the important thing for people to understand is the Department of the Army, the Department of the Navy, and the Department of the Air Force have service secretaries, so civilians that really work in conjunction with the service chief to advocate for the budget, really give direction on organize, train, and equip. And SOF was always accounted for within those service bins, if you will. So, USSOC would have been handled by the Army, and NSW by the Navy. But I think everybody knows that SOF is not usually front and center for these services, even at the height of the CT fights. So what I think the legislation you mentioned here in the last few years to really reinforce the service secretary roles has allowed us as a SOF enterprise to have a voice. So what this means in the most basic is when Secretary Austin, Deputy Secretary Hicks convene their service secretaries, Secretary of the Army's there, Secretary of the Navy's there, Secretary of the Air Force is there, and now I am there as the representative of SOF. That is extraordinarily unique and also something that I think gives us tremendous placement and access, as we might say in different contexts, to both hear where the department is going, but also to advocate for all the things that make the SOF enterprise what it is. And not just the operators, but the part of the budget to have the enablers, that recognition to be in the right places. We've talked in the Commander's Decision Roundtable here just this past weekend about how SOF is often an afterthought when we think about things like war games, because the services want to come forward with all their LISCO, their high-end capabilities to show what a high-end fight looks like. But there's a card thrown for the lead up to that. Well, that card thrown up in many respects doesn't account for the value that SOF brings in the shaping the environment, or in some cases preventing a conflict. And so my team is doing the sort of unglamorous work oftentimes of the department of making sure that the SOF enterprise and the SOF value proposition is represented in how the department talks to itself. That's become incredibly important as the counterterrorism fight has become less of a priority, still priority, but less a priority in the context of the national defense strategy and the pacing threat of the PRC and the acute threat of Russia. So if we're not there and people don't know what we do, especially outside the counterterrorism crisis response realm, you're not going to be accounted for. And that's not a good place to be when it comes time to make hard decisions, or in some cases allocate the budget or the priorities of the department.
That's incredible. So you and General Fenton have to work together to sort of articulate our requirements, articulate budget and everything else. How do you guys work together to accomplish that?
It's an important partnership, and General Fenton's a great partner. We've worked together in past instances when he was in the department and when he was at SOCPAC and Indo-PACOM. So we have a good relationship that goes back quite a while before we were in these two roles. We're very collaborative with one another, and I think there's a bit of a comparative advantage, and you go left, I'll go right. So one of the authorities that's incredibly important, I think, in the SOLIC context is the ability to approve the budget each year. So while $14 billion, roughly what we have in MFP 11, doesn't seem a lot compared to the services, it's still a lot of money and gets a fair amount of scrutiny from Congress. So I often will take the inputs from the SOF enterprise through General Fenton on his recommendations, and then ensure that we're accounting for all the priorities we have on the budget side. He is better positioned, as you might imagine, to engage with the service chiefs. So whether that's the CNO or the Chief Staff of the Army, and then I'm really in the position of handling more, not only the service secretaries, but in the overall Department of Defense, the OSD components, the Office of Secretary of Defense components, whether it's policy or intel and security or acquisition and sustainment. Those are more how I'm interfacing with the department to make sure that the SOF value proposition is accounted for. And put more of a fine point on it, General Fenton and I talk at least 2-3 times a week. We have set times, and then we have other times that we're dealing with whatever might be a driving issue that we're working on. And it doesn't only stop there. My deputy talks regularly to both the deputy commander and the vice commander, who folks may not know. There's a 3-star vice commander, Lieutenant General Frank Donovan now, who actually sits in the Pentagon. No other combatant command has that. And it's more of a reflection of what you said in your introduction about the COCOM piece and the service-like piece. So in the law, it's 164 and 167 that makes SOCOM so unique. So with that, I think we have a lot of touch points both down here in Tampa and then in the department to make sure that we are staying as aligned as possible. Last thing I'll say on this is my philosophy, even with General Clark, we talked about this a lot, is I feel like my job and my team's job is to stress test things that may be coming into the department from the SOF enterprise we can get behind closed doors and hash it out. But then when we come out of those closed doors, we need to have the best possible product for the SOF enterprise, bringing all our different perspectives and then if it's my job and General Finn's job to advocate for whatever we've decided, then we know we've done everything possible to have, in some cases rehearsed it, even to the point where we get together and figure out how we're going to convey certain narratives and what might be compelling with certain interlocutors or certain influential people, not only in the department, but the interagency.
It's pretty amazing. I got 2 questions I formulated out of that, but I'm going to get to one right now real quick. So I've met Mike Lewin and Aaron Logan already, but he doesn't do it alone. He's got a whole team up there, and every time I go up there, I'm in awe of the talent. Like we just had Michael Lewin address my course when we were up there. Phenomenal job. And then Aaron's done it a couple times as well, and it just I can't get past how interesting and amazing the talent is up there. You talk about the team a little bit.
Sure. So you hit it perfectly, which especially the service side being relatively new, it takes a lot of hustle and a lot of real thoughtful people to have the impact against, in some cases, the prevailing winds of, hey, this is the Department of Defense. There's a certain way people like to do things. So we're, 1, a hybrid organization, and 2, we're a little bit of the new kids on the block, if you're thinking just from the service side. So that requires a fair amount of entrepreneurial approaches and building relationships, not unlike what many of the people watching this podcast will undoubtedly think they've done and are still doing. So we are still relatively small, about 50 people or so doing the service side. Contrast that with hundreds, if not thousands, in places like the Department of the Air Force and others. So we're a bit of an upstart, and we've very much
that's a good way to put
very
it.
much focused on the aspects that we think are going to be most important for getting the outcomes we think the SOF community needs and deserves. So a lot of unglamorous things like focusing on analytics. Said in another way, this is how the department often talks to itself and its budget determinations. In the past, I think the SOF enterprise has not had to develop those skills because the absolutely operational prowess and the effects we were having on the battlefield spoke for themselves. And we were, for all intents and purposes, the supported entity. Now that the services and the rest of the department doesn't necessarily view it that way, we've got to be able to engage. And Mike Lewin, I think, came up with this concept, which I'll easily steal from him, which he's used to, which is we can't beat the numbers people with just a narrative anymore. We've got to be able to go back and have those analytics and those justifications that resonate with people who ultimately are providing the secretary and the deputy secretary the advice on the decisions they should make. So the team is very impressive, and they do these things that are very unique to how the Department of Defense does things that I certainly don't have the background in many cases requires that degree of specialization to actually talk specialist to specialist.
Yeah, no, it's important to know when you say you don't have the background in. You don't need the background in. What you need the background in is navigating that Pentagon apparatus, right? That's what you make the big bucks for, and I think that's important to note.
Just to point out, I don't make big bucks, but
I
know what you mean.
Big-ish. If I'm a guy, I was in a team room at one time, and like, how is all that happening above me to make sure I can get on the X, right? Which is where he's about to go back to, really.
So you mentioned a small team and some of the challenges that come with that, right? You don't have this robust force when you're compared to the Department of the Army or something like the Department of the Air Force. But there's some opportunities that you can leverage being smaller as well, right? The larger an organization grows, the more cumbersome and bureaucratic it becomes. So there are some things there that you can leverage, and SOF in general, because we tend to be a little bit smaller, and just making sure that we're optimizing and being meaningful and purposeful with everything that we do when we allocate resources.
Yeah, I think that's spot on, and we haven't talked about it much, but SOLICs existed, as you mentioned, since the same time that SOCOM was stood up, but most of what SOLIC has done over the last, 35 years or so has been on the policy side of the house. So I think doing the interagency work to get targets approved for counterterrorism missions and making sure that there's the right allocation of emphasis for authorities and For those that are familiar with the Deputy Director of Special Operations on the Joint Staff, we have long been the OSD equivalent of that, and more of the interface with the White House and the other departments and agencies. So we're able to draw on a lot of that more established piece to help the service side and vice versa. And my team hears this all the time from me, that we need to be better than and bigger than our individual parts, the sum thereof. And my dual reporting structure is one that I report through the Undersecretary of Policy, so the Secretary's primary policy advisor for all these policy-related issues: counterterrorism, soft policy, FID, counter-narcotics, irregular warfare, information operations, this whole kind of basket of issues. So that gives me the ability to influence the policy side in determining where we're trying to go as a department. And then on the service side, a lot of the actual implementation of that is where we're at least giving some of the guidance and helping to advocate for things like more funding for information operations, or further emphasis on some of the changes that we're undergoing in the NSW sphere with some of the undersea. And so it becomes a little bit of the one side helps with the what, where we're going, and the other side helps with the how to help us get there. And so I think in many respects we're a close parallel to Special Operations Command, because of the combatant commander responsibilities are much more operational, but with the service piece that actually helps it be a reality in terms of organized, train, and equip, and some of the acquisition authorities. So it's the way we think about it, and being able to leverage people from both sides, but never enough. So you're always looking for people who can do two-fers and three-fers as opposed to just one thing.
Yeah, that's also, you talked about the acquisition end of it. I think therein lies maybe something a little subtle difference than the services, because we have an executive here at SOCOM through our SOF ATNL piece that actually can do acquisition. How do you guys interface with that rapid acquisition piece in order to we don't get ahead of our skis, if you will?
Yeah, it's a really good question. One of the things that the acquisition environment authorities does is quite different. So, the services have some role, but SOCOM has by far the most powerful acquisition authorities of any combatant command. And so I think from our perspective, in addition to already mentioned having ultimately the final sign off on the budget, making sure that we're prioritizing for resourcing those acquisition projects that are the most important. So it all comes back to money at the end of the day. And I think that's where we start. And then looking from a strategic perspective, what types of programs are really going to be important for pushing our soft transition ahead. So if our value proposition in integrated deterrence and the campaigning aspects of the national defense strategy is doing things differently in some cases than we've done them in the counterterrorism fight, then we need to look at ensuring that those capabilities, those acquisitions are, proceeding apace. So we've very much focused on, for instance, the Armed Overwatch platform as something that SOCOM is really on the hook to execute. So that becomes what we call a special interest item for us, where we're not only making sure that things are staying on track, but advocating with Congress and in the department to make sure that funding line remains protected. But also the undersea and some of the surface capabilities that NSW is developing, these are really important for our ability to create dilemmas for the PRC, and in many respects punch well above our weight. We need to make sure that those programs stay on track, and that if there's issues that we're able to advocate to get them back on track. Obviously, we do all this in conjunction with SOCOM. But it's for those that haven't had the benefit of seeing kind of the acquisition machine in SOCOM, you should be very glad that you've got that sort of as a set of wind at your back, so to speak, because it's really important for making sure that some of the exquisite and soft specific equipment, kit, even in some cases, some of the information backbone and data centric approaches that operators and enablers rely on so much is actually being looked at through a soft perspective, not just, if you will, service common approaches.
Yeah, and sometimes those things get adopted to be service common as well. You talked about interfacing with Congress a little bit. I know we have a legislative affairs branch with SOCOM, but if you could, if you're no name dropping,
Yeah.
of course, if you're not comfortable with that. Either give a vignette of what that looks like, maybe in the last recent 6-7 months of interfacing with Congress to sort of push something forward and get advocacy.
Sure. So we kind of approach it from two perspectives that are very much aligned with our two roles. So the policy side of the House has every couple days is having some kind of congressional engagement, sometimes with members, sometimes with staff, because over the years, Congress has legislated in law requirements to update regularly on a lot of the operational activities. Obviously, it's done in a classified setting, but we're seeing the same staff and members who are then making decisions on other parts of how the enterprise goes, such as acquisition, such as the share of the budget and things like that. So we're then obviously working on that side of the house like the services would, but we, I think, have a distinct advantage of being able to represent to Congress how the operational effects are being achieved, so that when we go back in and say, we really think you need to put more emphasis on this in the budget, or this particular area has risk because it's been underfunded or underemphasized, we can then point back to, and remember last week when we were up here telling you about this crisis response or this counterterrorism operation, and there's people walking around who say we don't talk operations with Congress. They clearly have not had the roles that we've had, because you are doing that, and it's a statutory requirement. Give you an example of one of the areas I think we have pushed hard, and it's got great support in Congress, is POTIF. So I think
I was going to go there.
as the services periodically say, we need to address some of the challenges that are not unique to their service, but things like suicide prevention, some of the mental health issues, some of the ability to bring service members back online quickly if they've been injured in a training accident or even in an operational environment. Hey, you SOF guys have POTIF. How do we get some of that POTIF?
Yeah, I'm going to break that acronym down real quick for the
sorry
audience.
about that.
No, that's fine. Pressure on the Force and Family. It's a program here at SOCOM that's created some years ago with funding behind it that literally takes care of the backside of readiness for our force, so that all the issues that a family can have or an individual can have can be taken care of to ensure readiness of the force. So
yeah, it's a great example, and it has a number of components that are pretty unique to the POTIF program. The cognitive piece, the emotional piece, spiritual piece, that's much harder to come by if you're in one of the services without access to POTIF. So it's a fairly expensive program, as you would imagine, and we periodically field leading questions that are both from in the department, but often from parts of Congress of, well, now that you SOF guys aren't so actively deployed, why do you need this? And this is really expensive. And what makes SOF different that the other services don't have this? So it's not often fiscally possible to extend something like POTIF to the services. So sometimes the question is, well, we should just level the playing field by cutting back on it. And through a lot of relationships that we have as an organization in SOLIC, that I personally have from years of working with staff and members of Congress, we've been able to find the champions of that to ensure that they continue to advocate for something like POTIF. And I think POTIF is a bit of a indicator of some of the other things. So SOF, why do you need to still be special, so to speak, might be the detractor's view, because you're not doing the things you once did, and therefore you should look more like the rest of the services, is often a point. And I think we've been able to articulate the value proposition. I often say to some of my folks, I feel like I'm in sales. I probably wouldn't be very good in sales because I've spent my whole career in government, but it's about telling the story and advocating for the things that make sense.
The advocation.
And I think this is very important in Congress, where on balance, members of Congress are very supportive of the SOF enterprise. They all know the sacrifice that this community has made and the tremendous strategic effects that this community has given our country over the years. But we need to make sure that this value proposition continues to be one that's current and forward-looking, as opposed to fading with time as people forget about the sacrifices in the global war on terrorism.
Yeah, so it's really coming out of the GWAT phase, which I think we've done a pretty good job of coming out of. But SOF is really in its creative phase right now. And you can't say, well, it needs to train on tanks, it needs to train on fighter, airplanes, that's not SOF. SOF is building relationships, building coalitions so that when a conventional force has to go in somewhere, all that stuff is done. Relationships are there, they're mature. I like to, just to go down a road, the Columbia is a great example of a great partnership over time that was built by SOF, 7th Group in particular. And it's amazing to see that occur. So couldn't be more right. And the avocation of the POTIF is absolutely critical. And we also have the Warrior Care Program. You're familiar with that as well. And same things behind that as well for advocacy.
Right. Yeah. So I am very focused on the human piece, the taking care of our people. I mean, I probably shouldn't be in this job if I didn't believe the first SOF Truth, right? But it's an interesting situation for us as SOLIC because many of the authorities and the primary amounts of money are in the service budget. So they're looking at it again through the lens of having to cover a whole series of different communities and different parts of their particular service. And I think our role often is to shine a light on the areas within the services that need more attention. And we're a separate voice representing the SOF enterprise in a very joint way that otherwise wouldn't be the case in the way the institutions are built with the services all being individual stovepipes. So it gives us the ability to look across the enterprise and say, hey, MARSOC's doing something over here that's really valuable. Maybe we should think about that in USSOC or AFSOC, but also being able to take the goodness and run that through whether it's Congress or the rest of the department and say, see, this is done at a high return on investment and we're able to extend this across the SOF enterprise with SOCOM. These are the sort of things that I guarantee you would not happen if we were in the pre-SOCOM, pre-SOLIC world of the services run things. And not only would SOF often be lost in that, they'd be generally down towards the bottom because the numbers aren't very big, and oftentimes the services are focused on what is the biggest bang for the buck, and that's usually a community that is much larger than the SOF component.
Yeah, so it made me think of something else, which was, SOF has a big people piece of it too, and there is an equipment piece, and we try to divest the things that we can so that we can modernize other parts, the mechanical pieces of the force, the equipment, the gear, right? And I know, we've over time, for me, understanding the AC-130s in my tribe a little bit, they've modernized over time. But what else are we looking at and pushing forward to try to modernize in SOF lately?
So I hope lots of areas. I mean, the priority areas that I've already mentioned a couple. Armed overwatch is pretty important because it allows us as a community to really have control organically over things like close air support and probably some of the light attack capabilities and maybe at some point even some of the ISR that otherwise is going to be increasingly pulled to other theaters because the Air Force isn't going to want to take a fourth or maybe even a fifth generation asset and have it be on ready standby for a close air support mission unless they have to, right? So, and then the undersea piece is really, really, I think, important as we increasingly look at the SOF enterprise having to be a key part of a primarily maritime fight with the Indo-Pacific and the littorals as well. And so I think looking for opportunities to not only have the ability to have that placement and access and ability to range in areas that maybe our surface or subsurface capabilities in the Navy can't get there, but looking at areas where there's seams, so to speak, between what the services bring. So, what MARSOC's doing to look at the littorals, for instance, is a critically important area, and making sure that the equipment is such that not only are you able to do something more than the Marine Corps can do, but you're also able to do something that the other services can't necessarily do. And so I think when we think about equipment, oftentimes it's less about the kit and the gear initially, although that's very important. It's more of what's the backdrop of the capabilities that's operators are able to reach back to. So if you believe that decision advantage is one driven often by information coming to either individual operators or commanders quicker than the adversaries getting it, that puts a huge emphasis for us on things like machine learning, AI, and the ability to ingest huge amounts of data, of which I think everybody knows, just even from their personal life, there's so much data out there, you can't possibly as a human being absorb it all. So we really need to give the advantage through technology and through probably some evolution of our TTPs to that operator, to that commander, to be able to see things faster and better than the adversary. Sure, we're going to be in the business of continuing to improve our weapons systems and some of the other capabilities that we rely on, but really, I think the distinct advantage is going to be whether we can get information to those people who are going to be the best in the world at using those weapon systems in a way that they can react more quickly, make decisions in an informed way, and that man learning or man-machine teaming, as some people refer to it, is critically important. So we're really looking at those types of capabilities. It's an area where certainly the services would say the same thing, but I think we want to have a SOF specific mindset and thinking to that, because fundamentally there's similar, but in some cases distinct mission sets we're going to ask our special operators to do, and they need to have those capabilities.
So I do know that, and when you made me think about the process of information, you want to get information processed, hire a couple of teenagers, right? Mm-hmm. Right? They'll be all over the social media. But I thought about that, and we're bringing in a new generation of folks in our formations every year, and it's incredible the amount of talent they have right now. And I'm just kind of thinking as economy ebbs and flows, what are you guys doing to help advocate for retention, in particular MOSs, AFSCs, rates, things like that?
Yeah, I think it's probably best to start from sort of where we are right now, which is, fortunately, the SOF enterprise is at near, if not record, levels of retention. So that's very promising, because I think it shows that even as we're undergoing this transition, individual members are deciding it's worth staying in. They're being challenged. They're having worthwhile missions. Their families are being taken care of, and they can see a future of where they can be even more impactful as they move up, be it in the team room or into command positions or other things like this that I think drive what this community is made up of, is very ambitious, very thoughtful, very competitive people. I think the recruiting challenges that the services are confronting now, of course, understanding that we all are coming in most cases from the services, that's a potential challenge and might have a bit of a bow wave that's going to have to be managed. Right now, it's not affecting the SOF enterprise because it takes a few years for even those that are assessing and selecting through their services to necessarily be affected if the numbers are smaller. But I think we need to be aware that retention piece is going to be increasingly important as we may have a smaller crew of people that are coming in to the different SOF components. And I think, again, this kind of goes back to some of the other things I've said of we need to make sure that our folks have the equipment they need, are increasingly keeping up with the technology that's out there, especially that our adversaries we know are acquiring, and making sure that they have the appropriate training and really have the opportunity to experiment and test with some of this equipment too. We often focus, especially at something like SOF Week, on getting the newest thing and making sure that we have the best integration and systems and all these sort of things. But in reality, the training piece of this is really, really important. And one of the things the SOF enterprise, I think, has been both good at, but we want to continue to advocate for, is the ability to actually get a piece of equipment, test it, try it out, make sure it's going to uphold to the standards that operators need, and then have that reflected back to the acquisition elements and the actual program of record keepers and all the folks that interface with the companies that are doing this work. Because at the end of the day, if it doesn't work when you're in some tough situation, it's probably not going to be worthwhile having it. So I think it's really important from, I'll just say, a morale perspective, to make sure that all the things that an operator needs to be successful are the things that we're continuing to bring to him or her. I think that very much helps on retention, probably cuts down the day-to-day frustration, but more importantly, I think invests properly in the high-end fight that we anticipate we're going to need to be prepared for with PRC and potentially Russia.
Yeah, no, it's important to note. I think I know you got a question probably. I'll get to that in a second. I think it's important to understand that a lot of what we were just talking about is SOF operator specific when it comes to retention, but we also in our community have to have the SOF professionals that enable this force. And there's also retention challenges there as well. And that's why we also advocate for the services and sort of, we make it fun to be in SOF. That's one retention tool in itself, but I'm gonna pause there and kick it over to my colleague for a question.
Yes, sir. So you mentioned some of the, I guess we've enjoyed the relationship of being supported over GWAT, right? SOF really wasn't designed necessarily to be, the primary actor, right? We're supposed to support conventional forces, right? And I think you mentioned, your close relationship with General Fenton, and you and the commander of SOCOM recently gave joint testimony in Congress, and you're articulating soft posture and how USSOCOM articulating that can help address some of the challenges laid out in the National Defense Strategy. From your perspective in the Pentagon, from lawmakers and policymakers, how do they view SOF's contributions as we transition out of that GWAT fight to more of a GPC, strategic competition, or integrated deterrence fight?
It's a really important question, and I think one that obviously doesn't have a standard answer across every member of Congress, but I think there is great support for the SOF enterprise. As I said earlier, I think though there's some interest and maybe in some cases even concern about what will SOF's role be in a integrated deterrence PRC type fight if that's our pacing challenge. And so what General Fenton and I did, not only in the posture testimony we did with our oversight committees, both kind of the authorizers who pass the laws and the appropriators who give the money, is a number, and I think more than 24 office calls with individual members where that's, as most folks understand, behind closed doors, that's where you tend to get the real kind of skinny on what people think, and lots of interest in tell us how we can be helpful to you all, said a number of members, in navigating this future fight. So if we think of the SOF enterprise as having three fundamental missions these days, crisis response as one, counter VEO or counterterrorism as a second, and then this integrated deterrence campaigning is often how we think of it in a practical sense role. The first two are well established, lots of reps and sets, tremendous resume on those. The third, though, is harder to explain, especially to people who have not the sort of the recollection back to, pre 9/11 days and what that actually meant in the SOF enterprise. And so lots of interest in how we as an enterprise are going to leverage some of the other domains that previously were not resident when, this was the SOF of our, fathers or grandfathers, right? And so that's things like, hey, information, how are you all as key players in the information space thinking about this? And one of the things that's a little bit unique in the U.S. military is a lot of the information capabilities, the information force is actually housed in SOF. A lot of our allies and partners do not have that same kind of SOF overlay. So it puts additional onus, I think, on us as an enterprise to invest in those PsyOpers, those IO professionals, and then cyber as well as being another area where figuring out how we both leverage cyber but also interface with cyber is another one. And then kind of third in that triad is the space piece, which is understandably the least developed at this point, both because of where we are as a nation in our military footing in space, but how human beings, which is primarily where SOF is going to play, really contribute to that process. And I think intellectually, lots of members of Congress understand when we say we can potentially gain placement and access for something like a cyber tool or a space-based capability. But we need to, as much as we can, demonstrate how we've been doing that, or at least give a concrete example in articulating that, what that actually means in practice. So I think there's great expectation, optimism of especially those members of Congress that spend a lot of time thinking about SOF. But I think the onus is a bit on us to bring forward those examples so they can continue to advocate on our behalf as well with their fellow members, with their constituents, and then in the budget debates that we all know go on every year in Congress.
Knife fights.
Knife fights, yes. We have our knife fights in the building. They have their knife fights on the Hill. I feel like I have a little more influence on one than the other, but I'll leave for people to guess which ones that is.
Yeah, I was just thinking, from my perspective, I've been in SOF for about 15 years and lots of deployments, and the value that I've seen, the deployment for purpose, right? Not just for presence, but for purpose.
Right.
Being that integrator, you're building the networks, you're building the relationships, you're strengthening that by, with, and through partners and allies. You're giving them the tools and the resources so that if necessary, they are more resistant, resilient. They're able to provide a measure of deterrence, right? And then, if necessary, fight, right? You're enabling that. And then again, of course, if things, we operate left of bang, if you will, we want to maintain stability and peace. But if things were to go kinetic, now you have SMEs experts on the ground that know the culture and all the stakeholders in the area and can advise on when, where, how we can allocate combat power if necessary, right? That's invaluable. And you can't just create that on a dime. You have to invest in it early, well before a conflict happens. And if you've done your job well, maybe it never materializes.
I think that's really, really well said. And I think, as I said yesterday in my remarks, some of the value propositions that we have as an enterprise is that deep relationships. Not just you decided allies and partners were important a few years ago and tried to fall in on kind of transactional relationships, so those deep relationships, and then leveraging that, as you said very well, to actually building capability of these partners and having them have the ability to deal with security challenges themselves. That's always going to be the best outcome. And then I think increasingly, as SOF is demonstrating the ability to work across multiple domains, we probably are increasingly going to need to diversify some of these relationships, whether it's with the partner of choice we already have and bringing in some of the other domain capabilities that we will be bringing, or maybe diversify out beyond just the SOF counterpart that we work with, but we may need to have relationships in other countries equivalent of the cyber enterprise or the information enterprise. Because I really think while the National Defense Strategy emphasizes allies and partners, we've lived this forever, right? It's kind of core competency of being effective in the SOF enterprise and having a degree of a relationship that is really, really resilient. Everybody has a relationship with their counterpart if they're doing their job, but having that relationship that can really weather really challenging circumstances, including potentially a high-end fight, is going to be just essential and not something that we will understand always that we're building towards it, but when we really need it, it's going to be something that is going to be absolutely a operational strategic imperative.
Yeah, it's a challenge, I think, with everyone's focused obviously on what's going on with Russia and Ukraine and EUCOM, and then you've got the South China Sea, PRC, and all these aggressive tactics, and we've got a lot of partners and allies and stakeholders there, but it's interesting to see how things shift and move over time, and we still have legacy, not only capabilities but relationships and investments in other parts in the world, and it's not something that we can do to just sort of drop those things or put them on the back burner and then chase the new shiny object, right? That's what we like to do. It's like, hey, what's this new sparkly thing over here? I want to go do that. But we have an obligation, I think, to maintain some of those investments, those partnerships, operations in all the different TSOCs and the geographic combatant commands, and not just the South China Sea, although that is our pacing threat, as you said.
Yeah, I think this is very true, and we shouldn't even apologize for the relationships we've built over the last many decades, because in many respects that's still going to be the key that unlocks the door with key partners. I think it's well known that trying to drive a wedge, if that's a way to describe it, with a country and their relationship with the PRC is probably not going to be the honey that attracts the bear, so to speak. Maybe a bad analogy there, but we are going to resonate much more with partners if we're helping them solve their security challenges and empowering them to do so. Most of those are of a local nature. Most of those have a counterterrorism or an insurgency aspect to them, and that can potentially be something that is the initial place we enter, but then build the relationship from there. I think we're doing that every day. And with that, if you look at it through the lens of our crisis response requirements, if you're in a place and even if it's a small footprint, that gives us tremendous ability to be there at time of need. I think we all know different stories of where individual members of the SOF enterprise were there doing something else. They might have been a solo. They might have been embedded with some force, and something happened, whether it's hostage taking or an embassy comes under threat, and they're suddenly part of this crisis response enterprise, not because they were initially intending that, but it's that placement and access. And I think being able to operate in small teams, if you buy the premise, which I think is really core to the SOF enterprise, I certainly do, that a small number of people in the right place can have outsized effects. We're continuing along that line. It may not be in all instances because we think it's for a counterterrorism outcome, but it may be a situation where that counterterrorism placement and access gives us the ability to do more of the integrated deterrence work, or at least sense some of what might be going on from adversaries, whether that's Wagner for the Russians or some of even the political and economic influence that the PRC wields in kind of the global South, the places that can't afford to say no to them, but nonetheless have to also deal with their own security challenges, and oftentimes are much more interested in working with the United States. So we need to work that to our advantage in all instances.
I think that's the future of our work right there. Mm-hmm. Important. Sir, we're getting close to the end of our time here. I want to ask you one more question.
Sure.
Well, what is it you'd like our audience to take away today from this?
So I think fundamentally you've got somebody in the form of my team and me that are looking at the SOF enterprise as an entity in and of itself. And it helps that this is in law, so it's not going away. And really not only the advocate for kind of in the department and in the interagency and with Congress and with the public, but also the ability to really highlight the capabilities you all bring and the hard work you're doing that doesn't always get the attention and frankly, whether it's on kind of our policy side or our service side, there's still a challenge with articulating how things like risk are really baked into an operational approach that isn't always the same when you look at other military activities. And so I think one of the jobs that I spend a lot of my time on proportionally is making sure that with our senior policymakers, they understand the care and deliberateness and professionalism of activities that are underway. That could be a JSET, that could be a train and equip type exercise, that could be a very high-end sort of direct action operation. And I think as people rotate into senior policy positions that may not have had the benefit of interacting directly with this community, oftentimes there's a lack of knowledge or a perception. And, we sometimes deal with the perception of I saw a movie or a guy all kitted out with
Yes.
a huge beard kicking down a door is what SOF is. And yes, that is true, but I think it's a lot of other things. And as I do my best, and I know the team does their best to articulate the value proposition of innovation, ability to take managed risk, the ability to really operate at a very small but mighty level, and having that strategic framing when we're undertaking operational or in some cases very tactical activities is really, really important for people to understand. And it's something that I think this community does extraordinarily well. And it's our job to make sure that you all are given the opportunity to continue to do that with the right capabilities and, in many respects, the understanding of the ability to do multiple things in multiple theaters against multiple adversaries with multiple complexities. So that's our job in a nutshell. I hope for those wherever you're sitting in the enterprise, whether you're in the SOF enterprise or just interested in it, you'll understand that we have a key role here to play to advocate for that. And certainly, as one of my bosses, Joe McGuire, used to say, cards and letters are welcome. Please let us know where we can be helpful to you all and where there may be things that we may be missing. Because at the end of the day, we're heavily dependent on what we're hearing from the team room, from the individual operator, enabler, and from commands below the level of 3 and 4 stars. So thanks for having me. I appreciate it. And it's been very, very influential for me to hear from you all. And I think at the same time, great to be able to say a few things to you all.
No, sir, it's great to understand the policy piece behind us and the great team that is serving us as well. Thank you for that.
Yeah, it's so important for someone who's joined SOF, like many of our listeners. They gravitate towards SOF because they wanted to do SOF core activities, right? Direct action, special reconnaissance, what have you. And that's one side of what we do. That's one aspect. But it's important to inform the SOF community, the enterprise, that there's this entire other side of it, the policy side. And we've got civilian advocates up in Washington that are allowing us to get the permissions, the authorities, acquisitions, and acquire the resources that we need so that we can go out and execute those core activities, those missions, and provide that value proposition to the DoD and the greater Joint Force. So I just want to say, on behalf of General Fenton, CSM Shorter, and the entire SOCOM team, I just wanted to extend our gratitude, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low Intensity Conflict, the Honorable Mr. Chris Maier, for joining us today. To our audience, hey, drop us a line on SOFcast@SOCOM.mil if you have a recommendation for future content. You can catch the podcast wherever you get your podcast content. And as always, thanks for listening and tuning in. We'll see you on the next episode of SOFcast.